we'll go ahead and get started. Meeting is being recorded. Okay, thank you for joining us this afternoon for our program, World's Fair Archaeology in Jackson Park. My name is Johanna Russ, and I'm a senior archival specialist here at Chicago Public Library Special Collections. I curated our current exhibit, From Swamps to Parks, Building Chicago's Public Spaces, on display now at Harold Washington Library Center in the 9th floor exhibit hall. Today's program is put on in conjunction with this exhibit. Our speaker today is Rebecca Graff. Professor Graff earned her master's and doctorate in anthropology from the University of Chicago and her bachelor's in anthropology from the University of California. In 2013, she was the recipient of the Kathleen Kirk Gilmore Dissertation Award from the Society for Historical Archaeology. She has led archaeological undergraduate fieldwork at DePaul, the University of Chicago, and now Lake Forest College, where she is currently Associate Professor of Anthropology. Today, she will discuss the archaeological projects and findings covered in her new book, Disposing of Modernity. And she's going to speak to us for a while, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end. And if you want to type your questions either into the chat or the Q&A along the way, we'll get to all of them at the end. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Joe, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming in the middle of the day. I'm just sharing my screen now, which will hopefully work. And hopefully you can see my first PowerPoint slide. Joe, can you see? I just want to make double sure.
Yes.
Okay, then we shall proceed. Well, thank you again for coming here. I am going to give a little bit of outline of this particular project that is now a book and living in the world, but also kind of try to connect it to what's happening in Jackson Park now, what archaeology is, and what we can gain in the city of Chicago by doing archaeological work. So this book is about garbage. So I thought it would be good to look at some of the garbage that we have around us these days. And certainly the COVID-19 landscape will have for archaeologists in the future a particular archaeological signature based on the types of things that we are using and discarding. So thinking of face masks for a while, more gloves before we decided that wasn't the way we were transmitting the disease. And of course, all of the extra Amazon and other packages people are ordering. So there'll be something in the future for future archaeologists to look at also. So this is my start to talk about garbage. I'm going to talk a little bit more and then get into the actual work that we did. Just briefly, I'm an anthropologist. In the United States, to be an archaeologist, you are trained in anthropology. So just wanted to show that. I promise this next one will be the last slide I show that has text, because I hate texty or super texty slides. To think about what archaeology is. So why do it in at the World's Fair site, and what is it? So some of the definitions that I use when I'm teaching about archaeology is that it could be just the study of the human past from the remote to the prehistoric to the recent. It could be the study through the material remains. A mindset, a way of thinking and knowing about the world is what I also like very much, because it says that archaeology has a particular way of looking at the material patterning of now. So we can do work now using archaeological tools. And the study of other people's garbage, which is especially fitting for the work I'm going to have the pleasure of showing you guys. So this project in this book is really a tale of two houses. One building, the Ohio building, that was one of the small kind of uninteresting buildings from the World's Columbian Exposition, and the Charnley House, which is still extant, designed by Louis Sullivan and his draftsman, Frank Lloyd Wright, on the Gold Coast of Chicago. So let me talk about this site, the first site in Jackson Park, especially because I'm so thrilled and looking forward to heading to the library to see the exhibit. The Chicago Park District archives were an invaluable resource for me when I was putting this project together, with lots of help from Julia Bachrach and from just having a chance to actually work with these materials. So it's very exciting to share this work. So I want to talk to you about Jackson Park. Of course, if you've been following any of the news, we know that the Obama Presidential Center is going to be in Jackson Park. That is the home. They are expected to be breaking ground this summer. And if you just look here where this red arrow is pointing, this is the, I'm not one of the most recent schematics, but a pretty recent one. The arrow is pointing to the now still extant Museum of Science and Industry, which was the Palace of Fine Arts from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. So this place, this part of the city, this park, is going to be on the world stage again in a very profound way, much in the way it was in 1893. So a little bit about World's Fairs, maybe, to make sure that we see this in a larger sociocultural context. But what happened in Chicago in 1893 was not, was unique in many ways, but also part of this larger tradition of having these big World's Fairs. Of course, people have been getting together all over the world across time to sort of come together and to trade and to have entertainments. And those are fairs in one sense, but these large sort of capitalistic modern displays of goods, this really starts in 1851 with the London Crystal Palace exhibition that was held in the Crystal Palace that was built for it. Everything was in this one structure, and this was to show sort of the imperial aspirations of England by showing the goods, services, ideas from around the world. This picture I like a lot because there's a fountain in the middle there, and one of the fountains that was on display at this fair, it was scented with perfume. It was run by a perfumery, and you were encouraged to then take your handkerchief and dip it into the fountain, take some of that perfume home with you for a souvenir, and perhaps to delight in you the idea that you should purchase such perfume. So this was the first one. There was another very big one in the United States in 1876 and in another park in Philadelphia, in Fairmount Park. But the big one that is important for understanding Chicago is what happens in Paris in 1889. And that's the Paris Exposition Universelle. This is where we got the Eiffel Tower. This was Gustave Eiffel's idea. This became now the symbol of Paris in many ways, but was really just sort of part of the, to get people interested in the exposition. And people from Chicago, along with people from New York and other American cities who were especially hoping that the next big exposition would be in their city, went out there specifically to watch, to look, to take notes on, to have one in their city. And of course, Chicago won. So in 1890, an act of Congress was passed that placed the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was supposed to be the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the Americas, but it took a long time to plan this out. So it was not going to be ready in 1892 and did open in May 1893. So this picture is showing one of the main views of the World's Columbian Exposition. This is the Court of Honor. You see here the Daniel Chester French Statue of the Republic, the Golden Lady on the right-hand side. And there is a 1/3 scale replica that is in Jackson Park now. And of course, if you've been following any of the work about the Chicago monuments, about reassessing the monuments that are extant to see what we need to do with them to come to terms with pasts and futures, Golden Lady is on that list. So keep an eye for her. You'll see her again in this presentation. So the World's Fair in Chicago was in Jackson Park and in the Midway Plaisance. In Jackson Park, there were over 200 buildings, waterways, as you can see here, infrastructure, lights, fountains, just a whole city built for 6 months to then be purposefully disassembled and have the area returned to Parkland. So the White City were the main buildings, white because they were literally painted white. And then the Midway Plaisance was that strip of land that connects Jackson and Washington parks. That's where we get the term Midway if you've been to a carnival back in the time when we used to go to things like carnivals. It comes from this. And here you can see an image that shows the Ferris wheel, which was Chicago's answer to Paris's Eiffel Tower, which of course this is the first Ferris wheel. And a lot of the so-called sort of ethnographic exhibits at the fair were also there on the Midway. The Midway Plaisance was overseen really by an entrepreneur, Saul Bloom, and the delights and the extra money that you had to spend to enjoy those delights got the World's Fair into the black. And that's why it was a successful undertaking in terms of the financial outlook as opposed to other fairs. So when you went to the Midway, you could go ride the Ferris wheel or the captive balloon ride, or you could have an ostrich egg omelet from the California ostrich farm. But of course, it was actually just a chicken egg omelet. But you had all these different opportunities to sort of be titillated by what was on display. So this is a picture I like to show because it gets at the scale of the fair. And that's one thing I want to try to show with the archaeological work that I'm doing, especially because I know many people listening might have been to the site, but if you haven't, or even if you had, it's really hard to get a sense of the extent of this undertaking, of having this 6-month-long city with 27 million tickets sold, probably representing 11 to 16 million individual visitors, because you had to go for more than one day to see it all, at a time when the United States population was 63 million. Of course, people are coming from all over the world also. So this is just the opening of the fair and a stereoscopic view of all of the people attending. It wasn't that busy every day, but certainly it could be packed. And it was, and so many people came to this. If you had the 50 cents for the admission, it was the place to go to. So while you were there, what would you do? A couple years ago, I think it was 2018 or 19, we had the John Singer Sargent exhibit at the Art Institute, and you may have seen, if you went, this picture, this painting that was actually on display also at the World's Columbian Exposition in the Art Palace, now MSI. You could also see things that were less high art, like go to the agricultural exhibits. This is the California exhibit, and this is one of my favorites because this was, if you can see at the top, a knight and rider made of prunes. Because what better way to show the agricultural bounty of California than by making things out of prunes? And in fact, this was done quite a bit. They had a Liberty Bell of oranges, all different sorts of substances made into other ones. But I like this picture because it just shows how packed the aesthetic was of these spaces, that you could just, to take it all in was a mammoth undertaking because there was so much visually there to consume. But you could consume in other ways too. And World's Fairs were very important because they were wonderful opportunities for different companies to debut their goods, to either create an interest and debut a product or create a national marketplace for something that was beforehand just a local product. So Cracker Jack, not invented at the fair apparently, but apocryphally said to have been, but definitely debuting around that time. Vienna beef sausages. If you ever eat a hot dog in Chicago, there's a good chance it's a Vienna beef. Debuts at the fair by a group of Hungarian Jewish immigrants. Pabst Blue Ribbon, not new at the fair, but became a more national product with its showing at the fair. And of course, Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum, another great Chicago product. So you could consume these things, and then after the fair was done, you could continue to be able to purchase and consume and remember. So in addition to the art and the different exhibits, the entire fair itself was something to be toured because of the future-oriented technologies that it was showing. Here's a picture of some of the lights at the fair. They had the electrical lights. Of course, why we have alternating current in the United States was the battle to get the concession for the electricity. Spotlights, arc lights, electrical fountains, all of this was a new and very exciting technology for the bulk of people who were seeing it at this time. And just as you could enjoy the lighting and extend artificially the night, you could also tour the background information about it. So you could go see the dynamos from General Electric shown here that were powering these lights, in addition to be able to enjoy and to see things with them. So everything at the fair was a lesson, a place to learn, and something that you were hopefully supposed to excite within you, this idea of bringing those ideas back to your town. So how did they do all of this? Well, quickly. To build a temporary city, even with a couple years of work and lined up, you would still need to figure out a way to do it faster or differently than you would a regular one. So in this case, they used this plaster mixture called staff. It had been used at other fairs also. It was not a brand new thing in Chicago, to cover the outside of the structures. So this is just a picture of a very thin coating of the staff that was on the outside of some of the structures. And it would look when it almost like marble when it was dried, though I'm sure if you went up close to it, you could quickly see that it was not indeed marble. In addition to having to come up with really sort of innovative building techniques to get this temporary city going and up and not super expensive, one of the things they also wanted to show was what the future of city living would look like, and the hygienic city and the sanitary city of the future. And they did this by deciding to pick up the garbage very consistently and to haul it to the far southeast corner of the fairgrounds and burn it in the scientific Engel garbage cremators. This is a picture of them here, which you could actually, of course, also tour if you were interested. So the garbage was trucked to that corner every day and burned in the most sanitary way. Burning is also something that came up because the fair there were fires throughout the opening of the fair, even before it was opened, because of the material that it was made of, but the fair was not expected to be decimated by fire. This was not the plan once the fair closed. So it closes in October 1893, somewhat abruptly because of the assassination of the popular mayor, Harrison of Chicago. But because of labor unrest, because of economic downturn, depression, and strikes, there was arson at the fair site before it could be dismantled and returned to Parkland. And this is just one of the very famous pictures. I told you, here's the Golden Lady again from behind, just showing kind of the decimation of the site and the desolate look of it. And again, this was always planned to be returned to park, but the way it went with the arson, the fires, and just the striking, the homeless people who are deciding to take advantage of this welcoming site to live in. There was a lot of food left behind too in some of the exhibits. The end of the fair was very different when what the planning had been. So where do I come in? But I was thought, okay, well, here's a fair. Here's a place where 27 million people came for 6 months or more, right? People are messy. It'd be interesting to see what this looks like archaeologically. We know there were the fire, there was sort of the dismantling of it. And then we know that there are still extant buildings, like, as you can see in this is the Museum of Science and Industry. I was surprised when I was looking for a project as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, just down the street, that no one had done any work at the fair site. And somehow I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to do so. So I did this over 2 summers, summers and springs, and I just want to take you through a little bit of it to see some cool pictures so you can see the park, especially since the park is about to be transformed yet again. So in 2007, with a team of volunteers, I was lucky enough to get, and I thought I saw Andrew Leith's name, so thank you, Andrew, for being one of the people working on this. We were able to do some testing in the area. So I looked at 4 different parts of the park by comparing with historical maps, and then also walking around the site and trying to figure out where the most likely places to see some intact World's Fair levels might be. So I looked at 4 different parts. I'm going to be showing you 2 today, but I looked at the Wooded Island, which I'll show you some more pictures, North Pond, which is right by the Museum of Science and Industry, the Women's Building, which if you look here, that circle is the footprint of the Obama Presidential Center. So looked over there. And then in the far southeast, the place where both the building that housed all the anthropological collections and the founder of anthropology, Franz Boas, was there putting those together, and the garbage. So we looked in all of these sites and we used a survey technique in archaeology that was very simple called shovel testing. So although I've had the opportunity to work with ground penetrating radar and magnetometry and some of these very expensive and scientifically forward geophysical techniques, this shovel testing worked really well. So let me show you what that looks like. The Ho'oden was my first site that I wanted to look at. This is a picture of the structure that had been there. This was the Ho'oden Palace that was gifted to the United States from the Imperial Government of Japan, was actually designed to be permanent in Jackson Park, and was there until 1946 when the final act of arson got rid of it. So it's on Wooded Island, and you can just see here it's 3 different buildings in different architectural styles. So this is the strip of land, what it looked like in 2007 when we went out to do the work. Today, if you've gone to Jackson Park, it doesn't look like that anymore, because the Yoko Ono sculpture installation and the mounds that they built up are on that. But that is the strip of exactly where the Hoden was. And today there is the Japanese garden next to it, but that wasn't the original fair site. That's later on. So that's the site. So to look at via shovel testing, here's some pictures. You dig a hole that with your shovel, it's about 30 centimeters in diameter. You dig down as deep as you can. All the material that comes up, the soil, you screen it. Those are those wooden sort of sifter looking things to recover artifacts, and then you put the soil back in. It gives you kind of a little photograph down into what is there, but everything is jumbled together. So we did those in this site and in the other 3 loci, including the Museum of Science and Industry area, which and there the lovely bucolic picture of doing shovel testing. And all in all, we did 150 of these shovel tests at these 4 different areas, sometimes with avian guests coming by. And this one that I'm showing, this is Ariane Williams, who's nicely digging here, is the parking lot. It's actually under the parking lot now because they redid this parking lot on Cornell for the Museum of Science and Industry, but this was our sweet spot. So I took the artifacts that we excavated and I analyzed them and determined what time period they were from. And then I put that information into a computer program called Surfer to just look for densities of 19th century materials. So like a topographic map, if you're looking at this, you read it similarly where the lines are all together. In this case, that means those are where the densest amounts of 19th century materials were. So those were good places to start digging. I also especially want to show this. This is something that is at the library. I don't know, Joe, if this picture is in any of the exhibits, but it's one of my favorites. It's just showing the Jackson Park before the fair, because I was interested in this northern area anyway, because it had been used and developed before the World's Columbian Exposition came. So I wanted to see if there was anything that was from before the fair that we could also look for. So in the following spring, I led a class at the University of Chicago that was called Chicago Studies Archaeology in Jackson Park, something like that, with a team of 3 other grad students and a class of 20 undergrads. And we started excavating. And this is just a picture to show you what the first day looked like. And here you can see the Museum of Science and Industry. And one thing to think about scale here is that this extant building of the fair, though it had to be completely rebuilt thanks to the work of Julius Rosenwald, it was one of the smallish, medium, maybe would be generous sized buildings from the fair. And it's quite enormous. And this is not one of the big buildings. So the scale is so hard to fathom, but one of the buildings from the fair, the Manufacturers Lumber Arts building, was the largest in the world when it was constructed. Okay, so we ended up putting 8 of our excavation units, the so-called square holes that archaeologists dig in, over the area. They're each 2 by 2 meters, so they're quite big for archaeology. And this is our very special one right here again by the parking lot. On some days it was very cold and unpleasant to do archaeology, and some days it was very warm and delightful to do archaeology. And we dug and we found a lot of stuff. So what did we find? We found in almost every excavation unit the remnants of the permanent infrastructure that was built for the fair. The networks of sewage, gas lines, water lines, electrical lines that made the fair possible. And because it was infrastructural, there wasn't really a way to make it impermanent. They used the same techniques, or even better, since they were the most modern ones, to build this. That's what made the fair a success, in the sense that it showed you what a future city would look like. This is why we get the City Beautiful movement coming out of this, and more work from Daniel Burnham, who was the director of works for the fair. But what we did find that I found surprising was that there was still some of the ephemeral architecture in Jackson Park. So if you look at this image, it might seem like we're doing some archaeological work, maybe in Greece, maybe in Rome. You see all those beautiful columns, but those are in fact plaster. That's remnants of the White City. In fact, these are remnants of the Ohio building, one of the small buildings from the fair. Again, thinking of scale, this building is represented on one of the maps I showed you by a dot, and it's actually quite enormous. So how did we know this was that building? Besides where it was located, I also compared what we found with historic photos of the site. Here you can see, besides my cat in the background, some of the plaster columns from that structure and some of the ceramic roof tiles. This is a plaster volute, this top of one of these columns. And then this one, which I'm always very proud that I figured out, is the bottom of one of those urns shown here. You can, if you hold it up, you can see, and it has, it almost looks like a pumpkin with the little indentations. In addition to the architecture that we found in this ditch, basically, we found artifacts, so non-portable things made by people. And in this case, these are glass cruet tops. So people were living in the Ohio building. I found out through my research. They had a whole floor for the servants whose behind the scenes work made it run. And I'll talk a little bit more about this building. So they were eating and dining in that structure. Oh, sorry, I took out a couple of those. And we also found, I think, some collar studs, buttons, little bits of plates, but it was really a lot of architectural materials. But I was wondering then, with finding a site where people were living at in the fair, because these people, the servants would have lived there the whole 6 months that the fair was open to upkeep this building. These small state buildings were used mostly like clubhouses. They didn't have exhibits. They weren't an important part that you must see. But if you lived in Ohio, for instance, you would probably stop by the Ohio State Building at some point, go look at the register to see if anyone you knew had signed in, who was also visiting the fair, take a breather, use the bathrooms. So you would use free bathrooms instead of having to pay, and generally kind of escape for a few minutes from the cacophony of sights and sounds outside the more familiar building. But I was interested in seeing how people took the lessons of the fair. So I left Jackson Park. I'm leaving it now for, though I do hope to get back to Jackson Park, and I'll end with that, to look at the Charlie Persky House, which is another wonderful place in Chicago that you should totally visit. You need to, once things reopen, Jackson Park and the Charlie Persky House, which is located on the Gold Coast. This is a picture of it, if you may have even walked by it. It is the headquarters for the Society of Architectural Historians, who were kind enough, Pauline Saliga, the executive director, to invite me to do the excavation here. And this structure was designed 1891, 1892 by the firm of Adler and Sullivan, with Louis Sullivan and his draftsman, Frank Lloyd Wright, for James and Helen Charnley. And when I was asked to do this, and I'll show you in a sec why, we didn't know very much. And we still don't know very much about the Charnley family. So this was hopefully ostensibly going to be a way to learn about them. I'm going to connect it to the fair though. So this site, and you can see it here, the house is yellow. And the area that right next to it, to the east of it, is where we were excavating, is very small compared to Jackson Park. So a lot different type of scale for us for our work. However, and there's another picture of it here, that the car on the right is actually parked on the site. And in fact, I was told by a colleague a couple of years ago, Spot Hero, that app that you can use to reserve spaces in Chicago, this site is on Spot Hero. If you want to park on the weekends on an archaeological site, or on this archaeological site, you are very welcome to look for it in Spot Hero. So this is the Charlie Persky House, and in the area that is now their parking lot, when they were doing some work in 2003 to waterproof the side of the structure, they revealed a huge bunch of garbage from the turn of the 20th century. Pauline Saliga contacted me a few years later when she saw our work in Jackson Park, news media about that. And I was eventually very happy to go and look at this trash from the time period of the World's Columbian Exposition, a little before and a little after. So I did 2 excavations here. One is a field school for DePaul University in 2010, just to show you again, we had this huge park to spread out in, and now we're in a teeny little driveway. And then again in 2015 through Lake Forest College, we were trying to answer some questions that we weren't able to answer the first time, which hence the other excavation. So what did we find? Well, we found a lot of garbage, and I got to write a book about garbage because it seemed interesting that in an area with the white elite of Chicago, we still were finding so much trash. And it turns out that this was not that unusual. In fact, what was the norm until at least 1915, when municipal garbage service starts in Chicago, was that even the wealthy sort of threw their garbage around in ways that we wouldn't think were proper, hygienic, or sanitary. So this is an article from 1906 where the German consul to the United States, who was headquartered in Chicago, was writing saying how disgusted he was by this view. And this is showing Streeterville. So now an elite part of Chicago, just strewn with trash. So I was interested in seeing what disposal habits were, especially because the World's Fair was supposed to show us what the future of city life would be, which included disposing of things in a much more scientific way. So at the Charlie Persky House, with the 2 excavations, we found over 28,000 artifacts. I'm never digging middens again. This is the archaeological term for these very rich deposits of garbage. And if you can see here, this is a Keeler and Sons Dundee marmalade jar, something you could still go and buy right now in many supermarkets. It's still being produced. What we were doing in the analysis of all of these materials was that we found that we could identify over 150 different brands and marks from the artifacts, and that a great deal of them were products such as the marmalade that had debuted at different World's Fairs, not just at the Chicago Fair, but at London, Philadelphia, and then after Chicago, Paris, St. Louis. And often the advertising of these products would then incorporate whatever they won at those fairs, which usually almost everyone seemed to win something, to try to continue to build more consumership. So we found a lot of things that had to do with food, or vessels that had food in them. And one of these was McLaren's Roquefort cheese. This is a very tiny little jar, it's like that big, of milk glass that still had the label on it. And this cheese, this is an advertisement from 1905, was made in Canada. So even with Wisconsin right there, someone in that area next to the Charlie House threw the garbage there, was buying cheese from McLaren. Alexander McLaren was in fact involved with the World's Columbian Exposition. He was one of the judges for the dairy exhibits. He was a judge, in fact, for the cheese competition. And interestingly, McLaren's Roquefort and McLaren's Imperial Cheddar won awards for best cheese at the World's Fair. We also found salad dressing bottle. This is Yacht Club salad dressing, and this is a local Chicago product. Chicago is the center of the commercial salad dressing trade at this time. This is a manual of salads from 1916. And I was interested in the advertising. So here's a hygienic new type of product. Many of these, again, debuting at fairs. What were they thinking when they used this? So you see this maid here, putting this mayonnaise salad dressing into some tomatoes. And this advertising copy from 1912 for Yacht Club reads, "In good society, a woman is known not by the company she keeps, but by the salad she serves. In Yacht Club, you have the perfect dressing, a combination of the finest ingredients, scientifically blended." So here, a change in class status is made possible through the proper consumption of products. Another thing we found was SK's albuminized food, which was a baby food, also something that could be used for invalids. There were no babies, there are no records in any census or otherwise of babies living at the Charlie House. So again, this points to maybe the garbage being from elsewhere or being used for the invalid purposes. Here's an advertisement for that product, from 5-pound skeleton to this. But what's interesting about this, if you look at the bottom, SK is for Smith Klein. And of course, SmithKline, GlaxoSmithKline is a company that is still around today. So a lot of the companies whose products we still consume were just starting at this time at the World's Fair, the turn of the 20th century, and we still have them with us. We also found things that were for food preparation consumption. This is a teacup from the Doulton Company. We found a lot of materials that were from the Stoke-upon-Trent region of the potteries in the UK. And then we found things from farther afield. This is a piece of Canton porcelain. This is export Chinese porcelain from Guangzhou that was made for the export market. One that doesn't have as tight a date range on it, but we could also at least see where it was from. So it came from quite far to get to its final resting place in Chicago. We also found things that had to do with health and hygiene practices that at this time were, of course, transforming. This is one of my favorites, which is a teeny fragment that you can see an H, and then it has an A, and then underneath W-I-Z. And this was a bottle of Hamlin's Wizard Oil, which is a local Chicago product that was used for rheumatism, diphtheria, lame back. It could raise the dead. It was used topically and orally. And when the circus came through, it was used for elephants as well as humans. So it turned out to be almost entirely alcohol. And after the, Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 passed, was not a product you could get anymore. We also found things that are more common and less alcoholic, like this Van Buskert's fragrance Sozodont for teeth and breath. So this renewed interest in dental hygiene and the professionalization of dentistry was occurring at this time. This is an advertisement for that dentifrice. So you can see what we found was the bottle without the metal top. But of course, at finding dentifrice wouldn't have been enough. We would need other means. We would need the toothbrushes. And we found many of those there as well. So we found toothbrushes. And the toothbrushes that we found are very different from the toothbrushes that you probably have in your cabinets. The ones we found were made of bone and boar bristle. We didn't find the boar bristles, but they were about this long. And that's what you would have also had to use. They were often manufactured from byproducts of the stockyards processing. Here's another cat for you too. You want everything, including the bone. So the bone would be used for things like toothbrush handles. The advertising for the toothbrushes and for all of that was also interesting. Very eerily similar to the advertising I shared with you about the salad dressing. I have an ad from 1890 from a company, the Prophylactic Toothbrush Company, and it shows a attractive young woman, and it says, "Good teeth are a woman's greatest attraction." So just like the advertising from the salad dressing, it's not like people even now, we don't read advertising and immediately think, oh, that's the truth and that's exactly what will happen if we start consuming this product or using this. But there was still something to it, that it was supposed to get people motivated to consume or to change themselves through the things that they put on their bodies or into their bodies. So it was interesting to see that. The other thing that we found that relates to teeth is we actually found some dentures, some partial dentures from that time period too. So not ones that you would necessarily want to use in your mouth, but ones that were from about 1890. So what did I do with all of this? And I'm going to put this in the chat. We actually built a website that is now hosted by the Chicago History Museum, called Digital Chicago. And the site that I built with my students at Lake Forest College was showing where the origin of all of these materials we were identifying from the Charnley House came from, if they came from their point of sale, a lot of pharmacies, for instance, around there, or point of manufacture. And I just wanted to see how that looked and how we could trace these different materials. So that, which I will grab the URL for, which is wonderful. I'm just so glad that, I'm sure there are errors in it, but I'm just glad that it's there for people to use, is still up and available. And you can search through and mouse over all of these different products. You'll see either a picture of the artifact and or an advertisement from that. And I did a map that shows the Chicago products, and then one that shows the world map, so that you would have a sort of a different view. So this is to everyone. if you would like to see that, that's there. Okay. So one thing you can't see because of my screen not working is I have a very nice thing to say that I'm probably out of time, which is an alarm clock that we found at the Charlie Persky house. So to sort of wrap this up and let there be time for some comment or questions, it was looking at these two sites, at the Jackson Park site and the archaeology there, and the archaeology 10 miles away at the Charlie Persky house, was looking at this period in history to see if the promises of the World's Fair, of the tastes, the different ways of living would come, how would that translate back home, especially in this home, the Charlie Persky house, that was built by, famous architects, designed by famous architects. It was apocryphally the first modern house. That's what Frank Lloyd Wright supposedly said about it. Open floor plan, lots of light. How did people take the ideas that they saw in Jackson Park and continue with them in their lives after the fair's conclusion, which was the hope of the people planning the fair? So you can't see my thank you slide either. So I just want to say thank you to the Chicago Public Library Special Collections, to Joe, to Chloe, to everyone for allowing me to share some of this. And maybe especially since I don't have my pictures able to be shown to you, maybe I will just wrap it up and take some questions. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. That was fascinating. So we do have a couple of questions that came in through the Q&A. Someone has asked, can interested individuals join an archaeological dig in or near Chicago? And if so, how would they do that?
Well, if I'm doing a dig, I usually am teaching undergraduates, but I like to invite the public. I'm not planning one right now. I'd like to get vaccinated first. But there are not many people who do work in Chicago. And I saw Michael Gregory is here, and he was excavating at Camp Douglas. There's myself, my colleague Jane Baxter at DePaul. Not many people do it. So there are less chances than we'd like. That said, I'm around, I have tenure, I intend to keep digging in Chicago, and you're welcome to shoot me an email, and I do try to make opportunities available. At the same time, archaeology looks easy in some ways, but the training takes a while, and to actually have the skills to do some of it. And the other thing about it is that the lab work takes like 10 times as long as the excavation. So there's more lab opportunities often than excavation. But that said, I also think it's important to show the public this. So email me. I don't have anything on the agenda right now. Hopefully next summer there'll be another Chicago project though.
Great. I will just say, I was able to do a dig when I was an undergraduate, and it was in France on an old church. But yeah, that professor would bring undergraduates over every summer. So free labor, but also a free trip to France for me. So it works out.
I did that too in France. That's the way to go. But yes, but you can also do it here if you look.
Yeah. We have another question. Somebody referring to the salad dressing advertisement, you mentioned that the person depicted was a maid, and they're wondering, how do we know they're a maid as opposed to a housewife or some other type of position?
Wonderful. So that was sort of knowing the time period and the dress that was sort of common for people who were in domestic service at that time. I made that assumption. It doesn't say anywhere on there, but she's wearing black with a white apron, and her youth and just everything sort of suggests that to me, just having looked at other advertisements and that. But you're absolutely correct in the sense that it doesn't have a caption that says that. But if you are also kind of aspirationally trying to join upper classes, you would also want to employ domestic servants to do that sort of behind the scenes work for you. The lady of the house should be eating the salad dressing, but not preparing things with it.
Great. We have two questions that are similar, asking about whether any coins were found from the fair or this time period.
I think we found one penny from like 1891, but I also told all my students that I would fail them if they told anyone we were finding pennies when we were doing things, because I didn't want people to illegally metal detectorist up the site. Certainly, if you think of the things that you lose when you go out, there was, again, I think like 1 or 2 pennies, but a lot more other, I mean, we found things like buttons, a lot more buttons than pennies. But I also, there are metal detectors who are going around, sometimes not with permission through the site. And sometimes metal detectorists can partner with archaeological work and archaeologists for good outcomes. And sometimes it can be used to kind of take stuff that doesn't belong. So yes, we found coins, but no, please don't go look for coins, I guess would be my other way of talking about this.
Great. Okay, if you can speak to this, someone's wondering, why were the buildings at the fair designed to be impermanent?
It was a time, I mean, first off, they got permission, or they chose to put it eventually in Jackson Park rather than other parks. And I feel like Julia and Joe could talk much more about this. With the intent that it had to leave, because they needed those to be parklands, the lungs of the city. They had to return to park. So it was never on the table to build something that would remain. The park was what was important, and it was going to be returned to park. And the other answer is it's cheaper to build things temporarily. And within this kind of world of these World's Fairs, this was what people did. They built things temporarily, transformed an area, and went away. And in that sense, I write in my book a little about this idea that I've taken Thorsten Veblen's conspicuous consumption and flipped it to be about conspicuous disposal practices. And what is more disposable, and showing us our current garbage habits of getting rid of all of this stuff, than building a temporary city just to throw it out. And the last part of that is that they had this idea that somehow the ideological messages of the fair would be more profoundly felt and worked through if there wasn't an actual sort of material counterpart that was still extant.
Great. Okay, so someone has written in and said the Camp Douglas Restoration Foundation is excavating this summer or fall, and volunteers are invited to excavate.
Yes, so, contact Michael Gregory if Michael wants to put his email into the chat.
And then someone has asked for your email address, Rebecca, and so we can either share it here, or we are going to send out sort of a follow-up email to all registered attendees. We could put it there if you prefer that for some privacy.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. It's graph@lakeforest.edu, 2 Fs, but I have to see things, so email is appreciated.
Great. And then Julia Backrack, wow, I wasn't supposed to say who asked that question. I'm sorry. What happened to the artifacts that you unearthed?
Thank you, Julie, for the question. They are all at the Illinois State Museum Archaeological Repository area. They are there if anyone wants to do further research on them, if different cultural organizations wants to borrow to show, since we have all those columns, they're all there. So they are in Springfield, Illinois, in environmentally appropriate storage.
Great. There's no other questions from the audience, but I had a couple, since we do have a few more minutes. I was wondering if you know if there have been any other archaeological digs at the other World's Fair sites that you mentioned, like Paris or St. Louis.
I have a colleague who has done work at the Crystal Palace. When I was doing this, it turns out there was someone who was working in Sweden at a site at the same time I was doing that. And then we both published articles that said, like, no one's ever done World's Fair archaeology but me. So it's us. And then my colleague, Johnny Gardner, was doing stuff as the Crystal Palace in London, but there hasn't been a lot. And that's the only, work that's been published. I believe in St. Louis, they might've found something in the 80s at the site, but it's not been systematically excavated and published and disseminated. So not a lot. I have a few friends in New Orleans who've mentioned some stuff at Audubon Park, and I would love to get there. There's clearly like another career just in digging World's Fair sites around the world that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Okay, someone's asked, why do we no longer have World's Fairs?
Well, we still do, except we don't go to them anymore in the same numbers. The biggest, most recent one was 2010 in Shanghai. And then there was one in Kyrgyzstan recently. And the only reason I know is because I study fairs and wanted to see, but I think they just became less popular with the advent of different forms of entertainment. You know, if you can put your Netflix on, you don't need to go traipse over to some other World's Fair site. But we do have sort of lingering bits of that, like the Olympic Games, which of course are starting 1896, so coming out of that same kind of sociocultural milieu. And we have things like Disneyland. Walt Disney's dad, Elias Disney, worked at the World's Fair. And a lot of what we see in those sorts of entertainments really have their root there. So we see other forms, I guess.
Great. And someone chimed in that there was one in Milan in 2015.
Yes, that's right. The Milan was, I talked to a couple of people who went, that one looked very good. So they are popular, but not to the extent that they had been at their high point.
Let's see, do you know where the cabin was located that Daniel Burnham used while supervising the construction of the exposition?
I always get confused now because I keep thinking about that cabin that was on Wooded Island, and that's not it. I know which one you're talking about. I don't recall. But that's a good point, that besides the fair structures, there were barracks for workers. There was Daniel Burnham's cabin. There was a refractory for meals for the laborers. So there was also another sort of temporary part of the fair that was up while labor was being done. And in fact, I always like to say I found out while I was in the middle of this project that my great-grandfather was a laborer at the World's Columbian Exposition doing some of this work. And I don't know if he actually stayed there, but certainly a lot of people lived at the site year round while it was being constructed.
Great. And we have a question about how to contact Michael Gregory. He has shared his email address with me, and I can put that in what we send out to all of the registered attendees, so that they can get in touch about the Camp Douglas. Just writing myself a note.
Michael, how much are you going to pay me for getting you volunteers? You can email me too. Yeah, but yes, the Camp Douglas excavation in the south side of Chicago. There you go.
Yeah. I was curious, what kind of permits do you need to dig in the parks or at Camp Douglas? Or
what, for the park, I had a permit from the Chicago Park District, and which demanded a $1 million liability policy as well, which I did not have enough money to fund. And that's when my dig stopped being my own gig, and I decided to trick the University of Chicago into being the liability policy people. So it went through their legal and our legal, and we did have the permits. There, depending on the site and who owns it, there are all different ways. If you're going through the state agencies to get a permission, or if it's Charlie Persky was a private owner at the Society of Architectural Historians, and so the permission was granted that way. But it is really important. You can't just dig. Because it's destructive as a discipline, right? You can't undig something you've excavated. So making sure that you have permission, that you're doing it well, that you're recording everything is super important because of that. So absolutely. And I had my permit on me at all times, just in case too.
I bet. We have a question. Is there a connection between the Field Museum and the fair?
Absolutely. So the collection that was the kernel of the Field Museum was made for the World's Columbian Exposition, including things that Franz Boas collected and some of the materials there. So the founding sort of bit of it, and the Beloit Museum actually was there. And then of course the Museum of Science and Industry, Palace of Fine Arts, that was the Field Columbian Museum right after the fair. The building still wasn't permanent. It was a little bit better than the others because they had to make it fireproof to have all the art there during the fair. But that's where it was before it moved to museum campus where it is today. So the founding collection and its first instantiation as an institution were at the World's Fair.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions I had. Oh, we have one more. Let's see. Was any of the detritus examined for parasites? We're curious about the public health aspect.
Nothing that I found, because I didn't have samples that seemed to lend themselves to that. I didn't excavate a water closet or a privy site. You can definitely do that sort of work, and certain people absolutely do. The trash that was uncovered by my colleagues in 2017 who did work in anticipation of some of the Obama Library street widening through the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, they found the parts of the garbage crematory, but it had been so highly burnt that I don't think even if there was something, it wouldn't have been in shape to actually do those sorts of analyses. But certainly colleagues elsewhere look at night soil and all these things to find out and reconstruct dietary patterns and parasitic patterns among the people.
Wow, that's fascinating. All right. Does anyone else have any more questions? We have just a couple minutes. I don't see any. So thank you very much to Rebecca. This has been a great presentation. And like I said, we'll be sending a follow-up email to all registered attendees and giving you some more resources and some contact information that we discussed. And if you're feeling safe enough, please try and come out and see the exhibit here at Harold Washington. It's open, we're open, and you can come and check it out. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.